Democrats in the United States House of Representatives want to formally censure the U.S. president for vulgar remarks he made during a meeting on immigration. Donald Trump reported to have called El Salvador, Haiti, and African countries shitholes. The chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus said in a media interview this evening that it's important to send a message to the world that Congress finds the statements to be horrible, disturbing, and factually incorrect. Tonight, we want to talk about the level of conversation, political discourse in the United States. When the leader of one of the most powerful nations and our influential neighbor refers to African nations in Haiti in such a vulgar way, and El Salvador, what is the impact? Taken together with other issues like wage inequality and racial bias, is it a sign of democracy in peril? In Toronto, Speer is a senior fellow at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and former advisor to Stephen Harper. And in Vancouver, Paul Kershaw, UBC professor and founder of Generation Squeeze, which speaks for younger adults. Paul, how do you feel about the level of discourse in the United States right now?
Well, there's no doubt that we need to characterize it as a malaise, but I think what we're seeing is more a symptom than the cause. And I think the cause has to do within the United States and in Canada more generally that some of the traditional lenses culturally we've used to describe politics and the economy are letting us down and becoming stale, and that's breeding cynicism in politics. Let me give you two examples quickly.
Sure.
First, think about the traditional left and the traditional right.
Okay.
The left of center in Canada for decades has been telling us, Canadian government has been getting hollowed out, and by hollowed out they mean we spend less. But the data from StatsCan simply don't support that by comparison with when my mom was a young woman. We spend, for example, on important things like medical care and old age security over $45 billion more a year. But when the traditional left of center doesn't acknowledge that, you incline a younger demographic to say, well, I guess politics doesn't do big things anymore. And you incline an older demographic not to acknowledge the important and impressive investments we're making, and that kind of makes them sort of become stale and sort of take it for granted and complacent about politics. So the left of center and people allied on that side are kind of getting that stale lens, which isn't helping our engagement in politics. But on the right of center, we have a typical narrative that says taxes, and taxes are high. And not only do the data internationally not show that Canada has high taxes, it misses the bigger point, which is, hey, when we spend $45 billion more on things like medical care and old age security, it's a problem if we only are collecting revenue by about a quarter of that amount, because it inclines Canadians to think if we only focus on the tax we pay but not what we get for it, that, we should get things from nothing from government. And that breeds a kind of cynicism and an entitlement in politics. And I think what we see in the States and to some degree in our own political narrative is a reflection of those two stale political narratives.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm going to pick up on those in just a moment. But Sean, I want to go to you and ask you, do you think that Paul is correct, that is symptomatic of a larger problem when somebody at the level of Donald Trump is conducting his conversation in this way? Does it contribute to a loss of faith in democratic society?
Yeah, similarly, I'd like to address some of the questions, the bigger questions that Paul's raised, but just on the question of discourse. I can't help but think what we're witnessing is a case of what Daniel Patrick Moynihan used to refer to as defining deviancy down. We used to have expectations around the way that our leaders would communicate, the norms by which they would govern themselves. The fact that this week Donald Trump held a meeting for 53 minutes in which he managed to remember the names of all the members of Congress around him, that he didn't fall victim to the typical hyperbole and false information that he tends to spew when he's communicating with the public, that was heralded as a major victory, is a sign that our expectations have reached a bottom level. And I think what that does is it represents an erosion of the expectation and norms that we place on our political system. No doubt there are a whole host of factors that have got us to this place. I can't help but think that the current president residing in the White House, projecting political power, is accelerating those trends because of his unpresidential behavior.
And do you think that influences us across the border as well?
That's a good question. I think thus far we've not seen evidence of a major case of declining expectations around the way that our politicians behave and the way our politicians communicate with one another and with the general public. But it's something I think we ought to be hypersensitive to. We've talked previously on this show about the case of the Prime Minister's ethics violation. I think we all ought to be hypersensitive, particularly our political leaders, about protecting the public trust in our political institutions. And instances like that, in and of themselves, may not represent a real threat. But over time, cumulatively, I think there is a risk that people come to have a deep disdain and a deep disconnect from our politics.
Do you think there is a mistrust or you believe that, Sean, if I understand you correctly, that people trust our political institutions and the institutions that they've created?
Well, I think, and this speaks to some of the broader issues that Paul's raised, there's a whole host of explanations of what's contributed to Donald Trump's presidency. There's a line of thinking around economic dislocation. There's a line of thinking around cultural anxiety. I think one that's received insufficient attention is the lack of responsiveness and inclusivity of U.S. politics. A 2016 poll showed that 8% of Americans believe that the Republican Party was extremely responsive to their needs. 14% believe the Democratic Party was. Another study that looked at the background and experiences and perspectives of members of Congress from the 90s to 2008 found that less than 13% had any experience in blue-collar work. I think all of those factors contribute to a lack of responsiveness, a lack of connectivity between the governed and those governing. And I think that is a major underlying cause behind the Trump presidency. And I guess all I would say is, well, there's some nascent, I think, evidence that we're starting to witness some of the same disconnect in Canada. I don't think it's reached quite the same level. And if anything, it gives me hope that we can start to learn from this experience and create a politics that's more responsive and more inclusive.
Do you agree, Paul?
I do have some of the hope that Sean is talking about. I think we have to concede that the way in which U.S. politics is unfolding contributes to, in Canada, politics becoming a punchline of some joke as opposed to a process to respect. And if you look at the trust data in politicians in Canada, they rank typically below used car salespeople. And that is a cultural malaise that then contributes to partly what we're seeing in the U.S. and even in our own culture, where politics is increasingly aligned with a kind of cult of celebrity. You know, think about Donald Trump as a celebrity politician now. We're talking about Oprah for president, and even our own prime minister. He didn't win a federal election because of celebrity, but he came to be a leader of a national party in no small part because of his important name and an important speech he gave at his father's funeral. And if it's the case that now we need celebrity to sort of break through in the world of politics, then our culture is inviting that kind of orientation where you're going to get celebrity and good sound bites, but not necessarily substance. And at the end of the day, we need substance to solve big problems. A wall's not going to fix a problem for immigration in the United States. A flight ban isn't going to address the terrorism. We need more complicated thinking and a greater commitment to some of our homegrown values to solve these problems. And the celebrity sometimes doesn't give rise to that in the world of politics.
Well, do you think that our prime minister doesn't have the substance?
I think actually, by comparison with what we see down south, we can applaud the level of substance that we see from our prime minister. But I don't think he in and of himself is like the sole person responsible for substance in politics. I think more and more we need our public narrative and our media to want to push through the politics of personality, move beyond that, and get to some of the big issues facing us today. We have some serious problems related to the environment, related to the aging of the population. And I guess this is one other way in which some of the cynicism is playing out in our democracy right now, because another key narrative that's sort of letting us down is like how we evaluate the economy. So this month we would talk about how we are at record low unemployment levels in Canada, and most politicians will then claim credit. We must be doing a good job. And that data point is absolutely correct. But I want to ask, really, so what? We need to be measuring like how much work do you need to put into your economy today to cover your major costs of living, and by that criterion, things are really deteriorating for younger people and anyone who's a renter because earnings have fallen so far behind home prices. The unemployment data doesn't capture that, and we need that more complex conversation. So the cultural frames we use to typically judge our economy are stale and not up to the times.
May I say something else, Carol?
Of course.
One of the things that Paul and his group have done over the years that I think is terribly important is bring attention to the potential for the development of a real political fissure around the question of intergenerational inequity in Canada. I think we ought to be much more sensitive to how our politics is responsive to different perspectives, to different issues, to avoid the emergence of the political fault lines that we've witnessed in the United States. Intergenerational inequity is one. I think there are others that we ought to be sensitive to. The rural-urban divide, questions around fairness, questions around the underrepresentation of certain groups in our economy and our political life. We talk a lot about underrepresentation of persons with disabilities, new Canadians, Indigenous people. Of course, those are topics that we need to be sensitive to. The underrepresentation of people without university or college education, roughly still 30% of our population, and I think there are very few political or policy voices speaking for them. So all this to say, we shouldn't assume that we're immune to some of the trends that we've witnessed elsewhere. And I think, if anything, the experience that we've seen in the United States, the United Kingdom, and in other countries around the world ought to cause us to affirm our focus on protecting against the types of fissures that have emerged elsewhere.
What can be done to protect against that?
Well, I think a couple of things. There are institutional changes we ought to make around our politics, democratizing the riding level nomination, focusing on government appointments to ensure that they're more representative. Many of the Senate appointments the current government have made ought to be lauded in terms of the credentials and credibility of the individuals, but more than 1/3 are university professors who may bring interesting ideas to the table but are hardly representative. I also think that there are some policy steps that ought to be taken, whether it's a greater focus on economic opportunity for those without university and college education, or dealing with some of the intergenerational inequity issues that Paul has been such a passionate champion for. I think if we can root a politics in a greater degree of responsiveness and inclusivity, I think we can protect against what we've seen elsewhere and ultimately preclude the erosion in trust and faith in our political institutions, which of course is something that ought to transcend partisanship.
What do you think, Paul? What are your ideas about how we can insulate ourselves from what we've seen elsewhere?
Well, at the institutional level, in the world of politics specifically, I think we could also mention that the shift towards proportional representation did hold out some hope that we could see some more of the diversity in perspectives come into our legislatures. And I think I personally lament the fact that we've kind of stalled in that conversation federally, and I'm curious to see how it'll unfold in British Columbia, where it's a big topic once again. I think more generally, though, Canadians need to look in the mirror as citizens and as consumers of media and try and resist the bitchiness, try and resist the mean-spiritedness, and actually look for the complexity. Look for the complexity in what is going on in terms of, what is government doing for us, that's important? What is government doing for us that could be better? And where do I need to step up in terms of my personal responsibility? I think there's some core values that actually are so good and strong in Canada. And I think if we can bring that right blend of a commitment to personal responsibility, a commitment to fairness, like you should get out what you put in, a commitment to want to make sure that there is some equality across our country, those things can hold us in good stead going forward, regardless of what our institutional practices are. But but this tendency to sort of celebrate, a strong person being mean-spirited risks getting in the way of that.
All right. Paul Kershaw, Sean Speer, thank you for a great conversation tonight.
Pleasure.